Welcome to this YSL tutorial. This is part one of a new series all about Excel VBA user forms. Now we have covered user forms as part of the main Excel VBA tutorial previously. The idea behind this series is we're going to break things down into smaller sections and go into a bit more detail on each one. So although inevitably we will cover a few of the things we've already seen in a previous video, we're also going to get into some of the more exciting advanced topics too. So this is part one, as I say, and we're going to start with the absolute basics of drawing forms in your VBA projects. So we're going to start with a quick look at how you can insert a user form, and then how you can edit some of its basic properties, such as its caption and its name, and some of the basic formatting properties as well. We'll then talk about how you can draw controls on the form, and again how you can modify the properties of those controls. We'll talk about a naming convention you can use for naming the controls in your forms and whether you should use that or not. And then towards the end of the video we're going to discuss some of the useful layout tools to help you to quickly give your forms that slightly more professional looking layout. So let's get started. Okay, so the basic aim of this video is to show you how to create a basic form which looks roughly like the one shown on screen here. It's not particularly sophisticated or complicated, and it doesn't even do anything yet, although I can type into the text boxes and so on. I can click buttons, but nothing will actually happen. So the idea here is to show you the basic techniques you will need to use in order to draw forms in the first place. Now, although this form is quite basic, the same techniques will apply to any of the more advanced controls that you'll draw later on. So that's the aim. We're going to start by showing you how to insert a form into the project in the first place. So to start with, we'll need to head into the Visual Basic editor, and as usual you can do that by either heading to the Developer tab in the ribbon and using Visual Basic, or pressing Alt and F11 on the keyboard. Once you've done that, you will hopefully be looking at your VBA project, and in order to insert a form, it's a lot like inserting a module into a project. A simple way to do it is to right-click somewhere in the Project Explorer and choose Insert, Use a Form. And that will be enough to generate your form for you. So that will appear in the main code area of the window. It should also open up this extra toolbar called the Toolbox, which we'll come back to fairly shortly. And you should see that if I just click away from the form, just to clear the toolbox, you should see that your user form appears in its own separate folder in the Project Explorer. Now, before we get on with the process of actually designing the form, I want to very quickly mention form views and how you can switch between them. And the main reason I want to do this now is because it's really easy to accidentally switch between different views of a form without knowing what you've done. I want to make sure you know how to get back to this view, which is the object view, or the design view as it's sometimes called. So the easy way to accidentally switch out of this view is when you're trying to select something on a form and you just double click by accident. If I double click on the background of the form, it immediately switches to what's called the code view of the form, and it generates an event handler. We're going to come back to the events of a form a bit later on in a different video when we talk about how to code forms, so let's just ignore this code for now. The main thing you'll want to know how to do is how to get back to the design view or the object view. So there are several different ways to do this. A simple way is to just close down the code view altogether. So if you click the cross in the lower of the two crosses in the top right hand corner, that will take you back to the form. Alternatively, you could have just double clicked back on the form object in the Project Explorer. If I double click on the user form 1 object here, that will take me back to the design view or the object view as well. It's also possible to right-click that object and choose to view the object rather than viewing its code. You can see you can easily switch between the two views there by right-clicking on the object and choosing to view its code or the object. And there are also keyboard shortcuts to do the same thing. So while you're looking at the form and design view, you can press the F7 key on the keyboard and that'll take you to the code view. And if I press Shift and F7, that'll take me back to the object view. So now we can start modifying the form's design, and pretty much all the changes you might want to be able to make to a form you can achieve via the Properties window, which should be sitting at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen by default. If it's not there, head up to the View menu at the top, and then from about 2/3 of the way down, choose Properties window, or just press the F4 key on your keyboard instead. When you've got the form selected, the Properties window will show you a list of all the properties you can modify about this form. Bear in mind that if you selected a different object in the Project Explorer, of course, it will show you properties of a different object. So make sure you've got the user form itself selected, either by selecting it in the Project Explorer or just clicking on it in the design view, the object view. Now by default, properties are listed alphabetically, but if you prefer, you can view them in a categorized list instead. The idea behind this, if I click on the Categorize tab, is you get exactly the same list of properties, just organised into groups related to their function. So I've got an appearance group for making changes to, of course, the form's appearance, and a separate group for behaviour, and so on and so on. Now perhaps the most important property to change to begin with is the form's name. This is how we're going to reference the form in code later on, so we certainly want it to have a slightly more descriptive name than just user form 1. So to find the name property, Probably the easiest way is to use the alphabetic list. Now I know technically it's not alphabetically listed, but the name property will shoot right to the top of the list, making it much easier to find. So rather than calling this one user form 1, I'm going to call this one film details. Naming rules and conventions follow the same rules and conventions as for other VBA names, so don't use spaces, don't use punctuation characters, and so on. And if I hit enter, I'll find that the form gets renamed in the properties window. Now you'll notice that this doesn't actually change the form's title. This is set via a different property altogether called caption. So this is just display text. We can type into here whatever we want. We haven't got to follow any rules in particular. So we can use spaces and punctuation characters. And you'll find the caption property, again I'm looking at it alphabetically listed. Caption property just down here. We can modify this. I'm going to call this one film details as well, but I'm going to stick a space in between the word film and the word details. So you'll see that change as I'm typing, in fact, in the title bar at the top. There we go, the name and the caption of the form changed. For the next section, I'm going to stick the properties window back into categorize view. This will put all the appearance properties together into a nice single group, because I want to start talking about changing the colours of the form. I'm going to start with the background colour property, or the back colour property as it's called, mainly because this will make the most obvious visual change to the form, away from this boring old Microsoft grey. Problem is, if I go to the back colour property and I click on the drop down arrow, what I'm presented with to begin with is just a slightly longer list of boring greys. Now, these colours come from the Windows theme that you have applied, so you can modify these colours via the Windows settings, but it probably makes more sense, rather than using any of the system colours, just to jump straight to the palette tab there, which gives you a slightly wider range of colours to choose from, including a bunch of boring greys of course, but some slightly more interesting colours there too. Now in the real world, it's likely that you'll want to reproduce a very specific colour for use in your forms, and maybe even other parts of your workbook. So if you wanted to get the full range of colours available for the form, even wider than the palette shows you, have a look at the blank rows of white boxes at the bottom of the palette grid. If you were to right click on any of these boxes, that will launch the Define Colours dialog box, and from here you can select any of the 16,777,216 colours that can be reproduced via the RGB system. So the idea is that you either click and drag to select a colour and then use a slider bar to change its intensity. Alternatively, to get a very accurate colour, what you can do is enter the RGB, or red, green, blue values for a specific colour that you want to generate. So each of these numbers here can be a value between 0 and 255, and the idea is that you enter a specific value to get a specific colour. Really quick example, and you may well have access to your own brand guidelines somewhere within your own company, but very quickly, if I go to a quick Google search for the NHS, this is just one that I know comes to light very quickly. So if I just search for the NHS blue colour and then go to the NHS brand guidelines page, there's the NHS blues colours definition is red, green and blue, so it's red 0, green 114, blue 198. There's a slightly wider range of colours there as well, and each one of these colours has its own very specific definition with RGB values. So to reproduce any of those colours, all I would have to do is head back to this grid and enter the numbers into these boxes. I'm reasonably happy with the boring old pale blue colour that I've selected there, so I'm going to click the Add Colour button, and that will add it into the palette and also change the background colour of my form. When you've added a custom colour to the palette, you'll find that not only appears for the property you originally selected it in, the back colour in this case, but also for things like the border colour and for the font colour and so on. So you'll find that reproduces itself elsewhere to make it easily available to you. I'm actually going to go back and change the back colour of my form back one more time. I'm going to go back to a plain old boring white colour actually, and then I'm going to change the fore colour of the form so that it's some kind of, I don't know, some dark blue sort of colour instead. Now you may notice that changing the fore colour didn't really do anything to the form at this point. There isn't actually anything displayed on the form at this point that can be changed to be that colour. The point of changing this property here at this point is that any subsequent controls that I draw on the form, things like labels and command buttons which have text displayed on them, they will automatically inherit that colour. Now I can still change that for the individual controls later on, but it can save a lot of time with formatting if you set up some default formatting properties for the entire form, which other controls will inherit at this stage. Another set of properties that will be inherited by other controls are properties related to the font. Now it doesn't look like there's much you can really do with the font property at this point, but if you select the font property you'll see a little ellipsis button appears, and if you click on the ellipsis you'll find a separate dialog box exposing way more properties about the font than you originally think. So I'm just going to make a couple of quick changes here. I'm going to change from the default Tahoma font to a Calibri font, I think, and I'm going to change the font size as well. I think that's a tiny little bit too small, 8 point. Let's go for a 10-point font size instead. So once I've done that, I can click OK. And again, that won't have any actual immediate impact on the form because there's nothing that's currently displaying text, apart from the form's caption, of course, but that doesn't actually inherit the font properties. But any subsequent controls that I draw on there, like labels and command buttons again, will use these font properties as their default values, which you can then change later on should you need to. The next set of properties I wanted to quickly look at were to do with this form's size and position. So again, you can find these in the categorized list of your properties window fairly easily. If you scroll down and find the position category, there's a height, a width, a top and a left property. There's also a start position, which we'll get back to fairly shortly. So the height and width are fairly obvious. These are measured in points, actually is the measurement unit for height and width. And of course you can modify these manually by typing into the boxes. You could also of course just do it by clicking and dragging the selection handles around the outside of the form. When you do this, it changes the height and width, of course, and in doing so will automatically update these properties here. Now it's probably easier and certainly easier to create more accurate heights and widths just by manually keying values in. So what I'm going to do is just manually key in something like 160 for the height and let's say, I don't know, 180 for the width. Something like that should be enough. The remaining three properties then in this section are the left, the top and the startup position. Now the left and top are relatively easy to describe. Left is the distance in points from the left-hand edge of the screen to the left-hand edge of the form. And top, fairly obviously, is the distance, same distance, but from the top of the screen to the top of the form. These only have an effect if you change the startup position property. So by default, the startup position will set the form to open up right in the middle of the Excel window. Owner refers to the owner of the form, which is Microsoft Excel. So the other settings there are center of the screen, so regardless of where Excel was positioned on the screen, your form would open up in the middle of your screen. Windows default is, well, whatever your Windows default setting is. And manual allows you to manually set this by changing the left and the top properties. I think it makes more sense for my particular form so that it starts up in the center of the Excel window. So I'm going to revert back to the center owner, and we'll see that when we run the form later on, it should appear right in the middle of the Excel window. So I think that's all the properties I want to change about the form itself for the time being. The next thing to do is move on and start drawing objects or controls on the form. Now, in order to start drawing controls on the form, you'll need to display the toolbox, and the simplest way to make that appear is to click once on the background of the form. So if I were to click somewhere on the background of the form, the toolbox should pop up automatically. Now if it doesn't, it probably means that it was closed down last time you were using it. So for instance, if I were to click on the cross at the top right hand corner of the toolbox, the next time I click on the background of the form, the toolbox doesn't appear. To bring it back, then the simplest way to do it is to click on the toolbox icon on the toolbar. Alternatively, I could go to the view menu and choose toolbox. Sadly, there's no keyboard shortcut to make the toolbox appear, which is a bit annoying, but there we go. And then the toolbox pops up and it shows you all the various different types of controls that you can draw on the form. It's a fairly limited list to begin with. You can always add more to it later on, but for now we're going to stick with the basic default set of controls. The first type of control we're going to draw is something called a label, and that's represented by the big capital letter A tool on the toolbox. Now a label represents descriptive text on your form, so it's usually drawn next to another control like a text box or a drop-down list, and it describes what to do, what to type in, what value to enter. We're going to have 3 of these on our form. So one way to draw a label is to click once on the label tool and then move the mouse cursor somewhere over the form. You'll see the cursor's changed to indicate you're about to draw a label, and if I click once with the mouse button, it will drop a label of a preset size. Another way to draw a label will be to click and drag with the label tool. So if I click and hold the mouse button on the label tool on the toolbox, I can then drag across onto the form and I'll see an outline of the label that's about to be drawn. So I just release the mouse button anywhere, that will draw the label at the position I've indicated. You can also choose to draw a label of a size you want by clicking on the label tool and then clicking and dragging on the form. So if I click and drag, that will draw a label of the size I want. Personally, I tend to draw labels of a default size, and then I know that everything has got a set pre-defined size. It's always possible to resize things later on if they need to be increased or decreased. I'm going to delete label 3 in that case. I'm going to replace it with a label of a default size. So if I select label 3, it already is selected, of course, you can see the selection handles, and then press the delete key on the keyboard, that will remove it. I can then either click and drag or just click once and draw another label on the form. It's also worthwhile mentioning that you can copy and paste existing controls. So if I were to right click on label 3, I can choose to copy it. I could also press Ctrl C to do that. Then of course I can paste it in elsewhere on the form. So if you want to duplicate labels or any other controls, copying and pasting is the simplest way to do it. Now if you have to draw lots of the same type of control, a quick simple technique you can use is to lock the control to the mouse cursor. So the next thing we want to do is draw 3 text boxes. So you'll find the text box tool by default right next door to the label, and the simplest thing to do here is to double click on the text box tool to lock it to the cursor. So if I double click with the mouse, I can then draw as many of these as I like. You'll see that this time if I draw a text box by clicking, it doesn't detach the text box tool from the cursor, so you can just click again, and as many times as I like. I can draw as many text boxes without having to go back to the toolbox each time. The easy thing to forget there is that of course you've got the tool still locked to the cursor, so to remove it or to unlock it you can head back to the toolbox and click on the select objects, the black arrow there. So that will release the toolbox, or sorry, the text box from the cursor, and you can go back to either selecting things or drawing other types of controls. 2 more controls to add. I'm going to use the same technique. We're going to add 2 command buttons. So I'm going to double click the command button tool, and then I'm going to draw 2 command buttons towards the bottom of the form, just like so, and then back to the select objects cursor, and then those are all the controls for now that we want to add to our form. Now, just like the form itself, every single control that you draw on the form has its own set of properties, and you'll see if you click onto different controls, you'll see the properties window changes to reflect the properties of that type of object. So currently I've got command button 2 selected. If I select the text box, I get a different set of properties, and a label a different set of properties yet again. Hopefully you'll notice that some of the properties have already been picked up based on the things we changed with the form earlier on. So every control that's on the form so far, the label, the text box, command buttons, have all picked up on the font properties. They're all set to Calibri rather than the original Tahoma. And that's true for the label, for the command button, and even for the text box, although it's slightly less obvious to see for the text box to begin with. If I scroll down far enough, I'll find the Calibri font. The labels have also picked up on the colour changes, the back colour and the fore colour. If I select label 1, you'll see the fore colour has been set to this dark blue colour, and its back colour matches that of the form as well, so it's this white rather than the original grey. So it was worthwhile setting some properties earlier on the form. It saved us a bit of time now. But of course there's nothing to stop you subsequently changing the properties of different objects. So for instance the command buttons, I'd kind of like to see the font of those in that dark blue colour. So I'm going to select the first command button. I can also select the second command button to change both controls at the same time. You'll see the properties window changes to show you common properties. So if I select command button 1, command button 1, command button 2, command button 2. If I hold down the control key on the keyboard and select a different control, so if I select command button 1 while command button 2 selected, you see a limited list of properties. I can't show the name property because each control has a different name, but they have a common back colour, a common fore colour. So I'm going to change these just quickly using the property window. I'm going to go for this pale blue background colour. I'm going to go for the dark blue font colour as we had earlier on. There we go. I think that'll probably do in terms of formatting changes, colouring changes. The next really important thing to do for all of our controls is set their names. Now when it comes to naming controls in a form, there's a couple of different conventions you might choose to adopt. The first one I'm going to talk about is slightly old-fashioned. It's a technique called Hungarian notation, or it's at least a modified form of it. It's not quite the original intention of the technique, but it's often described as Hungarian notation. So the idea behind this technique is that you prefix the name of each object with a little code that indicates what type of item it is. So for instance, for a label, if I select label 1, this is going to have the word film name or the word title in it. It describes the text box next door to it. It informs the user to enter the film's name. So to name this label, I would change its name in the properties window, so it's called LBL, film name. So the idea is LBL indicates that the type of control is a label. While I'm here, I'm also going to change the caption. Now the caption doesn't really matter what you enter in that, it's just descriptive text that appears on the form. So I'm going to type in the word title for that one. So again, for the label 2, if I go to the label 2 and I change its name, this was going to refer to the film's gross takings in dollars. So I'm going to say LBL film gross. And then again, I'm going to change its caption, so it's called something like, I'll just put the word gross and then put in parentheses a dollar sign to indicate it's meant to be in US dollars. And likewise for label 3, I can go back there and choose LBL. This one's the film's release date, so I'm going to call this one film date. and then the caption can be something simple like release date. Okay, so that's the convention for labels. Text boxes begin with txt. So if I select the first text box and then go to the name property, I'll change this to txt, film name. And then the next text box will be txt film gross. And then the third one will be txt film date. Last of all, the command buttons. If I select the first command button, I'm going to call this one CMD, short for command. That's the convention. CMD, add to list. So the idea is that clicking this button would add the current details that the user has entered into the existing list of data on the worksheet. Then I'll change it to caption, so that just says something like add to list. Nice and simple. Then the second command button will be the one that cancels the form and just closes it down without doing anything. So I'm going to call this one CMD cancel, and then change its caption so that's called cancel as well. Now obviously we've only drawn 3 different types of controls here, so we've got LBL for labels, TXT for text boxes, and CMD for command buttons. There are lots more control types you can add to a form, of course. If you're interested in the definitive list, I suppose, of Hungarian notation conventions, then a not bad place to start would be with a quick Google search perhaps for Excel VBA forms, or in fact VBA forms Hungarian notation. So there will be a link there to a Microsoft knowledge base article. If you select it, you'll see several different tables on here which indicate the standardized conventions for types of things. So one thing I didn't do, I didn't add Hungarian notation to my form itself. So ideally, if I was following this convention for everything, I would have used FRM in front of my form name. So you'll be able to see there, of course, all the different types of controls and the different prefixes, or yes, prefixes you're supposed to use. Okay, so what's the idea behind Hungarian? The idea behind doing this in the first place is when you're writing code that references these objects. If I go back to my VB editor, and if I just double click on the background of my form again, just as a quick simple way to demonstrate the technique, if I double click on the form to go back to this code view we saw earlier on, if I look in the IntelliSense list for objects on my form, if I just press Control and space on the keyboard, and if I start typing the letters LBL, I'll find that all my labels are neatly grouped together. So regardless of what their descriptive name is, they all begin with LBL, so it's nice and easy to find them in the list. Likewise, if I go for TXT, I find all my text boxes. If I went for CMD, there's all my, CMD, there's all my command buttons. So that's the idea. The problem with this is that Hungarian notation has kind of fallen out of favour in recent years. You'll find lots and lots of articles about this, about describing why Hungarian notation is bad. And a not bad place to start actually with Hungarian notation and the pros and cons is the Wikipedia entry. You'll find a advantages and disadvantages section on there, and if you're really interested, please do have a quick read. I'm not going to, of course, describe all of these things. I'm going to show you an alternative technique, a slightly more modern convention for naming controls on forms. I'm not trying to recommend one or the other here, by the way. This is purely to show you what's available. It's very much up to you to make your own choice here. So the other type of convention, I'm not sure it actually has a name actually, it's just not Hungarian notation. Rather than prefixing each control's name with a little prefix like this, LVL, what I would do is for the label, I would call this film name label. And then for the text box in which the user enters the film name, I would either call this film name text box, which in the real world I don't tend to do. What I would tend to do with this is I would just call this one film name. This describes the object which is going to actually hold the name of the film that the user is going to enter. So rather than describe what type of object it is, I just want to reference that as film name, almost like a variable name. It's just a container to hold a piece of data. So the idea behind this now is if I went back to the code view of the form, if I just double click, rather than seeing items grouped by type, I see items grouped by the value entered into them. So if I press Control and space again and look for film name, I see the film name and film name label both together in the list. Now there might be other controls that I add to the form related to the film name text box. So I might have maybe a hidden error message in a label as well. So again, I would call that film name error label, something along those lines. So that's the idea behind that approach, and that's the approach I'm going to take for this particular video as well. So I'm not going to use Hungarian notation. I'm just going to go back to my form in Design View or Object View, and I'm going to rename each of my other controls so they're not called. They don't have these little prefixes. So rather than LBL film gross, that's going to be film gross label. And then the text box itself will just be called film gross. It describes what the piece of information actually is. Likewise, back to release date, and I'll call that film date label, and then the text box will just be called film date. And then the two command buttons, again, I could call this add to list button if you prefer. I probably wouldn't bother with the button. That's not going to be related to any value that the user can enter, so there'll be no corresponding text box with that. Personally, to keep things nice and short and clean and easy, I will call that add to list. Cancel, potentially I would actually add the word button. Cancel can be used and you'll find cancel used as a keyword in various other parts of VBA. For instance, it exists as a parameter for certain event procedures. You can cancel events. So for this one, I would probably tend to call this one cancel button. I guess I'm kind of mixing and matching conventions there. There's a little bit of a lack of consistency. Personally, that's the approach I take in the real world. As with all conventions, it's not really massively important which one you adopt. It's just that you choose to use it consistently. So for me, this is the style that I go with. If you're more comfortable with Hungarian notation, please by all means use it. I'm really genuinely not trying to discourage you from using it. Whatever you think makes more sense to you. Just be prepared for snobby advanced level programmers to turn their noses up at you if you do use Hungarian notation from time to time. I've been in that situation myself, but you can feel free to ignore them. Okay, so now that we've got all of our controls labelled and named and formatted appropriately, let's do something to sort out their layout. Now earlier on I kind of deliberately drew the controls a little bit haphazardly, and it's starting to make me feel a little bit uncomfortable because I'd never really in the real world draw controls this disorganised. What I'd like to do is align them and distribute them so they have a nice, sensible, professional looking, neat layout. So I guess the simplest way to achieve this is just to click and drag on controls to move them around on the form. So I pick the gross label, rather than text box, the gross label first, and just start to click and drag to move it around. If I click and hold the mouse button on it, I can start to move it around. It's relatively easy to achieve a neat layout by clicking and dragging. You probably see, hopefully you can make out there, that the control's moving in little jumps, little steps. It's kind of snapping to the divisions in the grid in the background of the form. Now the steps are quite large to begin with by default, so just very quickly before we continue with this, I want to show you how you can modify the grid settings. To modify the grid settings, you can head to the Tools menu and choose Options, and then on the General page of the dialog box you'll find the little section to the Form Grid Settings. So you can turn the grid off altogether if you like. You can turn off its display. If I uncheck the Show Grid box, that won't stop controls snapping to the grid. If I want to do that, I can just uncheck the Align Controls to Grid checkbox, and that will stop controls actually snapping to it. All I want to do here is I just want to modify the divisions, the increments in the grid. So what I'm going to do is change from 6 down to 2 points, just to give myself a little bit finer control, and then click OK, and you'll see it changes how much the control jumps by each time I move it. So it gives me that little bit finer control. Now you may prefer not to use this at all. You can turn the grid off altogether as we've just seen. But I'm going to stick with this this 2-step increments in the grid. And that means I can click and drag to move things around reasonably easily-ish. Makes it a little bit fiddly, but it's still possible to achieve. So there we go. Now in the real world, again, doing this by hand is really tedious, particularly for much larger forms with many controls on them. So what I'm going to do is sort of deliberately mix these up a little bit again and talk about a couple of really useful tools that you can use to help lay out your controls on a form. Most of the techniques we're about to cover in this section are much easier to achieve if you've displayed the extra User Forms toolbar. And probably the easiest way to make it appear is to move the mouse cursor up towards the top menu bar and then right-click and simply choose User Form. The toolbar will appear somewhere on the screen, and I'm going to click and drag to move mine up and nest it at the top with all the existing toolbars. Most of the controls on this toolbar rely on you having multiple items selected. So for instance, the first thing I'd like to be able to do is align the title, gross and release date labels to the left-hand edge of the title label. So I need to select title, gross and release date. One way to achieve this is if I select the title label and then hold down the control key, I can click on other individual controls one by one and add them into the selection. So that's one way to make it work. Not necessarily the quickest way though. If I click in the background of the form again to deselect everything, this time I'm going to click on the title label, not text box, title label at the top. And this time I'm going to hold down the Shift key. If I hold down the Shift key, I can click on the release date label, and that will select everything in between the first and the last one that I've selected. Probably the easiest way, and the technique I tend to use more often, is to just click and drag a selection box around the items I want to select. So the trick to this is starting with the mouse cursor in a blank part of the form. Now the box you draw does not have to enclose the entire control in order for it to be selected, so I can safely start with the mouse cursor somewhere here in a blank part of the form, click and hold the mouse button as I drag a box which at least partially encloses all the items I want to select. So if I release the mouse button at this point, all those items will be selected. Before we align the controls together to the title label, you've got to make sure that the control you want to align items to is the dominant control. So you'll hopefully see that from the 3 items I've got selected at this point, there's one with a set of white boxes around the outside and 2 with black boxes. The one with the white selection handles is the dominant control. So if I apply any of these layout or alignment tools to this set of controls, they'll all take their cues from the release date label, which isn't quite what I want. To make the title label the dominant one, all I've got to do is click somewhere on it, and you'll see that that one now has the white selection boxes around it, and the other 2 have the black. So now that I've done that, I can find the appropriate tool to align all the other controls to their left-hand edges. So the tool that I want is this one, the Align tool. If I click on the drop-down arrow just to the right of that, I'll see a list of different options. Probably the, I guess, little icons are probably more helpful than the descriptions there. So I'm going to go for the lefts option, although in this case it doesn't really matter left, centers or rights, because all the labels are exactly the same size anyway. It doesn't actually matter which of these 3 that I select. I'm going to go for lefts, and you'll see that everything now comes in line with the title label. Now I'd like to do exactly the same thing with the 3 text boxes. I'd like them all to be aligned to the left-hand edge of the top text box. So again, if I select all 3 by clicking and dragging a selection box around them, and then making sure that the top text box is the dominant control, this time I don't need to click on the drop-down arrow to select Align Lefts. Because it was the last option I selected, all I need to do now is click on the button, and once again those 3 objects will be aligned to the left-hand edge of the dominant one. The next thing I'd like to do is make the spacing between the controls equal. Now, before I do that, I'd like to move the bottom text box up quite a long way. So I'm going to click away from the group of controls and then just click and drag to move the bottom text box all the way up here. Next thing to do is select all 3 text boxes again. You need at least 3 items selected to make this technique work. Annoyingly, you can't select this tool from the user form toolbar. This would be a really nice addition to the toolbar. But what we can do is head up to the Format menu at the top of the screen and then choose the option that says Vertical Spacing. Now you can see there's a couple of options in here. I can nudge them all up so that there's no space between them at all by using the Remove option, or I can increase and decrease it. But what I want to do here is make the spacing between them equal to distribute them evenly. So if I choose Make Equal, that'll set all 3 text boxes so there's an exact even amount of space between the 3. Now the next thing we're going to do is align each label with its corresponding text box, because clearly that isn't the case at the moment. Before I do that, I'm also going to reduce the height of each label, because I don't know if you can see at the moment, the text in each label is aligned to the top of the label, which means if I put it alongside the text box, it looks as though it's offset, which it looks a bit messy. Now, as far as I can tell, there's no property available that lets you change the vertical alignment of text in a label. There's one for the horizontal alignment. It's called Text Align, and I can change it to the left, right, or centered, but nothing for the vertical alignment. So the simplest thing to do here is to reduce the height of the label and then align its center or its middle with the corresponding text box. So I'm going to reduce the height of this label just by clicking and dragging on its resizing handle. Now I've reduced that to pretty much exactly the right size, and I don't want to have to do that to each other individual label. So while I'm here with the title label selected, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and then click on the release date label. they're all selected. The title label is the dominant control. What I'm going to do now is change everything so that their height is exactly the same. So another tool on the user forms toolbar allows you to change the height so that everything's the same height as the dominant control. So that saves me having to do exactly the same thing to each of the other labels. The last step then involves selecting each pair of text box and label individually, like so. You want to make sure that you've got the text box as the dominant control this time, and because we don't want to move those ones out of position. And then we're going to use the align tool and align the middles. So once you do that, one text box and label, second text box and label, and the third pair. And that's a reasonably neat looking layout. So hopefully you can agree that doing all that by hand would be a bit tedious. Having done it using the user forms toolbar, things are a lot simpler. One last technique to talk about in terms of automatically laying out controls is specifically to do with command buttons. There's a couple of sort of default arrangements you're likely to see with command buttons on a form. One has them arranged along the bottom, just like we've got them here. Another arrangement has them aligned along the right hand side, so you'd tend to find them more like so. Now the cool thing about these default layouts is that there's a couple of options in the menu that allow you to create them automatically. As long as you have multiple buttons selected, you can achieve this really quickly. If I select the add to list and cancel buttons, like so, I've got the add to list button as the dominant control. If I then go to the format menu and choose arrange buttons, I can choose to put them along the bottom of the form, like so. And then if I go back and I go to the format tool and I choose arrange buttons and make them right aligned, they go to the right. You see the dominant control is the one that sits in last. So if I change that around and I use the cancel button first, so the cancel button was the dominant control, like so. If I go to the same tools, format, arrange buttons, bottom, it is now the add to list button which comes along on the left hand side. And again, if I go to the format tool and use arrange buttons and go to the right, cancel sits at the bottom of that. So I'm just going to rearrange them one more time so they sit along the bottom of the form. So arrange buttons to the bottom and then resize my form by changing its width property again. So rather than clicking and dragging and sort of trying to judge it, it's much easier, I think. Oh, there you go, got it, 180. I was going to say it's much easier just to type in the number into the width property of the form properties window, but there we go. Now that we've spent so much time arranging our controls so neatly, it'd be a real shame if we were to accidentally knock them out of alignment. And trust me, I am just about clumsy enough to do that more times than I care to admit. So what we're going to do is put these controls into a group. Simplest thing to do here is select all the controls you want to group together, and then you can either right-click on all the controls and choose to group them, or you can use the toolbar as we added in earlier on and just choose the group tool on there. So if I choose group, you'll see that you get one single selection box around the entire set of controls. To give myself a bit more space, you'll find that if I select the group now, clicking on one single control selects the entire group, you can move the entire thing around in one go without the risk of moving them out of alignment. You can still change properties of single controls inside the group just by sub-selecting them, so that you can see when you've got the entire group selected, you've got the common properties of all of the items inside the group, so you won't see the name, for instance, or the caption. But if I were to select a single item inside the group just by clicking on it again, you'll see that now I get the specific properties for that single object. So I've got the film date label selected. And again, I can sub-select other items inside the group, like so. So it's the sort of the best of both worlds kind of a thing, really, grouping. It allows you to keep together all the items inside the group, but still individually modify each one should you need to. The only minor downside to grouping controls is that there's no real visible indicator that they're grouped together. It'd be nice when the form's running that the user could see that those items are part of a specific group. So one way to achieve that is using a basic tool called a frame. Now, ordinarily if you decided you were going to use a frame, you would draw the frame first and then draw your controls inside it, because sadly you can't draw a frame on top of existing controls. Well, technically you can, but the frame will just sit on top of the controls and just mask them. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to modify our form and make its width quite a lot wider, and then we're going to draw a frame control inside the form. I might need to increase its height a little bit there as well with the default size. Let me just increase the height of my form there. Okay, so the idea now is that I can drag existing controls inside the frame to simulate drawing new controls inside it. So if I click to select the group of controls, I can drag the entire set inside the frame. They don't necessarily need to be grouped here, by the way. I could have an ungrouped set. And I forgot to mention, in fact, that if you did want to ungroup your controls, you can happily just right-click on them and choose Ungroup, or use the same tool on the toolbar. So if I choose to ungroup them, they now behave as individual controls again. So there's my frame created, and I've got my controls inside it. I'm just going to resize the frame and then position that somewhere a little bit neater on the form. So I'll drag it back over to the left there, and then just resize the form one more time so everything is reasonably neat. I'd spend a bit more time doing this in the real world, of course, and probably end up typing in my values so that they're accurate and precise. I should give the frame a name, and I should give it a caption as well. So if I select the frame and then just use the properties window to change, let's see, its name first of all. Let's call this one film details frame. I've already got a form called film details, so I can't just call it film details. I'll call it film details frame instead. And then the caption will simply be, I guess once again, I'll call this one basic information. Again, this is free text, so you can type in whatever you like. Now again, frames work in a similar way-ish to grouping controls. If I wanted to move all the controls around, as you saw, I can select the frame and move the entire frame, and everything that sits inside the frame goes along with it. But once again, I've still got the ability to modify the individual controls within it by selecting them. So these are no longer part of a group, I've ungrouped them, but I can still move them around together as part of the frame, or modify them individually. The single advantage really of a frame is that it gives you a nice visual indicator as well. So when the form is actually running, then you'll actually see the outline around the group of controls, and it's a nice way to visually split up a large complex form. Having spent all this time designing the form and making it look as professional as we can, it'd be nice to see what it looks like when it's running in Excel. So just as a quick sort of preview for the things we'll be covering in the next video, what we're going to do is click once on the background of the form, and then just as you would with a subroutine or another procedure, you can either click on the green triangle button on the toolbar or press the F5 key on your keyboard. When you do that, you ought to be taken back into Excel with your form appearing on screen in based on its startup position, as we talked about earlier on. It's interactive after a fashion. You can click on the buttons certainly, although nothing will happen, and you can click into text boxes and you can type things in, but of course nothing will happen when you click the buttons again. But it's a nice visual indicator as to what your form will look like when it's actually running. If it's not quite what you expected or not up to your standards, it's not too bad an effort really. It's better than most of the forms I design in the real world, I have to admit. And what you can do is close down the form and then make further design changes to it. And hopefully you have enough tools at your disposal now, and you know how to use them to make your forms look exactly the way you want. I guess the rest is pretty much up to you. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseOwl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.